My name is Joel Bleiberg, if you don't know me, and thank you for coming out on such a chilly evening for some Torah inspiration. Thank you to Rabbi Welcher and Ahavas Yisroel for their generosity in hosting tonight's event. And thanks to Mark Frankel. Where'd you go? For helping set this up. And thank you to our sponsors, Midreshet Adina, Chazaq, Aleph, Beta Academy, and Max Lindenfeld. When I heard that my wife Leah was arranging for Rabbi Forman to come, I was not surprised. She quotes him very often, using ideas from both his books, especially when learning with her partners in Torah. She listens to many speakers, but I see her excitement around Rabbi Forman and his insights. It's really something special. When you hear about his accomplishments, you'll see why. He has lectured internationally on biblical themes, and is the main educator at Aleph Beta Academy in the Five Towns. He has taught at Johns Hopkins University. He's been the lead writer and editor for Art Scroll's Talmud Translation Project, and served as a scholar for the Hofberger Foundation for Torah study for the past 10 years. He's written 2 books, and I see them on my table all the time. All the time. The Beast That Crouches at the Door, about what really happened in Gan Eden, and The Queen You Thought You Knew. This one's really good. I started reading it, which reveals all the secrets about Purim. And a new book that's coming out shortly, explaining many of the difficulties in understanding Yosef and his brothers. And if I understand, we have some of the books for sale?
Yeah.
Outside?
Outside.
Cash only?
Checks.
Checks too?
Yeah.
Okay. Made out to?
Aleph Beta.
Aleph Beta. Okay. You can also see his presentations online at Aleph Beta Academy. Before I give Rabbi Forman the floor, I want to just make these announcements. Tomorrow night, for women only, it's sushi night at 8 o'clock. Where is this going to be? At Ol Simcha on 72nd Avenue. Also, Chazaq is having Rabbi Yossi Zakatinsky on Sunday night, January 18th, with remarks from Rabbi Rosenberg. That's also at Eitz Chaim at 8 o'clock. And without any further ado, I've done it for you.
Okay, hi everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see you. I see some many familiar faces in the crowd, many not so familiar faces, so feel free to come over afterwards and introduce yourself. Again, if you enjoy this kind of learning, there's a lot more of it online. Most of my day job these days is really producing material for the nonprofit I founded called Aleph Beta Academy. It's a tongue twister kind of name, which we probably should change, but it is what it is. It's Aleph Beta. It's kind of hard because you're not sure if it's Aleph Beta or Alpha Beta or Alphabet or whatever, but it actually is Aleph as in the Hebrew letter and Beta as in the Greek letter. So it's Aleph, A-L-E-P-H, Beta, B-E-T-A.org, and you're welcome to, you can get all sorts of content there, and there's an app you can download onto your tablet and phone and just kind of take stuff with you. And I'm really happy to say that a lot of this material is now in schools as well. So if you know schools that would like to get involved, you can have them contact us at alephbeta.org. Just go to the website, and teachers can sign up for accounts. We've got about 160 schools that are using the material in the classroom now, which is really exciting. Let me ask you this question. So imagine after 120 years, God comes to you and says, you've been a very good girl or boy, and we have a nice spot in heaven reserved for you. But while we're getting things ready, you got about an hour, and we have a special treat just for you. So you're very excited about this. What's your treat? So your treat is that the angel in charge of heaven, the mezzanine section, lets you know that you can ask to meet any person from Tanakh, and you can spend an hour with them in a coffee shop on the next cloud over. okay? And you can ask them whatever you like. You can really get to know them in just an informal chat with your favorite hero or heroine. Ask them what, and if you want, you can spend the time talking philosophy. If you like, you can spend the time trying to learn about the life. Or you can just try to find out who they are. What kind of person was this person who you really want to know? Who would you pick? What would you ask them? What would you try to find out? So I imagine there'd be a lot of different answers in the room. But one of the answers that I would give, if I were given that choice, is I'd want to know about Rachel Imenu. She is a tantalizing, enchanting figure. She enchanted Yaakov the first moment that he met her. It was not puppy love that died in a moment. He spent his whole life in love with Rachel. The father of our nation was enchanted by this woman, and he never really had her. She was switched on the night they were supposed to marry. Her child is taken from her when he's just 17 years old. He spent his whole life in mourning for that child, hoping and mourning Rachel. She's not buried with him. The minute he sees her, he cries, Chazal says, because he has the text says, Chazal explained, because he had some sort of premonition that he would never have her. What is it that he saw in her? I think the person of Rachel enchants us too, not just Yaakov. All you need to do is go to Israel and know that one of the most popular places there is Kever Rachel, right? And we don't even know if historically it's her grave, but it's one of the most popular places. Everyone goes to Kever Rachel to pour out their hearts. And yet we know so little about her. What do we know about her anyway? What we do know about her is the kind of thing that would even make you not even so interested in meeting her. What do you know, really? You know what happened to her, that she was victimized by her father and switched under the chuppah. Other than that, you know that she stole the truffim, okay? And what else do you know? You sort of kind of know that maybe she gave the simanim to her sister, except the problem is you don't really know it in the text. Chazal tell it to you. So it's like, and you have to ask yourself, if she's such a heroine to us, if she's so much of a hero, then, is that it? And I think that one of those, that Chazal, that statement that Chazal make about her giving the simanim to her sister so that her sister wouldn't be embarrassed, is really one of the most famous Chazal there is. Why is that Chazal so famous? I think one of the reasons it's so famous is because it gives us some way of relating to Rachel, because without that, we're lost, The text doesn't seem to give you a way to relate to Rachel. How could that be? That God's book, the book itself, doesn't give you a way to relate to Rachel. It just doesn't seem to make any sense. Plus, what's worse is that the text actually does spend time on Rachel, but it doesn't give us stuff that we'd like to hear. As a matter of fact, the stuff that it does tell us is almost, we feel like closing our ears and not listening to it. It's the very painful exchange between her and Leah about this conflict that they're locked in, about these children, about the love of a husband, and you hear it in the names of the Shvatim, and it just seems like a voyeuristic look into the pain of a woman. And why do we even hear about that? Why do we hear about all that stuff? So I think the bottom line is there's something enchanting about her. The Torah doesn't seem to give us much help. Tonight I want to suggest to you that the Torah does give us a lot of help if we learn how to read it. The Torah actually does tell us why Rachel is a heroic figure, why she should capture our hearts. It's just a matter of learning how to read it. If I'm successful with you tonight, I hope that you won't have to wait 120 years to recreate the coffee shop in the cloud experience with Rachel. I hope that in an hour tonight, we can try to do that, to capture the feeling of an hour in a coffee shop with our mother, with Rachel, and have some sort of sense that we know her. The avenue that I like to take, and I'll tell you frankly, I had no idea of any of this until I stumbled across something one day. It's actually a funny story. I'll tell you the story. I was in Chicago at a Sheva Brachas, a marriage of my cousin, and it was Shabbos Sheva Brachas, and we had been up since like 3 in the morning and going on a plane, and there's nothing worse than going to a Shabbos Sheva Brachas from the other side, and you're exhausted, and then there's these interminable speeches, right? So somebody gets up, and you have no idea what they're talking about because they're talking about the other side, and you're sort of dropping off to sleep, and you're thinking to yourself, how embarrassing, how absolutely mortifying. And my wife is there, and she's thinking, how absolutely mortifying. Like, how could I be falling asleep, there? So, and then in the middle of this speech, she like kicks me under the table, and I think like, I'm up, what's wrong? I'm not even falling asleep. And she says, no, you should actually listen to what he's saying. Right? I'm thinking, what? I should actually listen to what he's saying. And then he's just said the most remarkable thing, which I want to share with you tonight. One little insight, which I think is a key to understanding the Rachel story. And it's not even an insight, it's an insight about a pasuk, but it's not even an insight about a pasuk in Chumash. It's a pasuk in Sefer Yirmiyahu. One of the ways we know about Rachel is through the psukim which are up on the screen right now. The most famous psukim in Sefer Yirmiyahu, Kol Barama Nishma, the vision of Yirmiyahu of a dead Rachel in heaven crying and pouring her heart out to God over the loss of her children. The 10 tribes, the kingdom of Ephraim, which comes from Rachel, has been sent into Galus, and she cries. She cries because her children are gone. Kol Barama Nishma, a voice is heard in the heavens, Nihi B'chi Tamrurim, a terrible, bitter cry. You still don't know who it is. And then you hear, Rachel Mavaka al Banah, it's Rachel crying over her children. Me'ana linachem, she refuses to be consoled, al Banah ki einenu, for her children because they're gone. Ko Amar Hashem, so thus says God in response, Mini kolech mibechi, hold back your voice from crying, ve'nayich midima, and your tears, your eyes from tears, ki yesh sachar lipulatech, because there is indeed reward for what you've done. Nu'um Hashem, says God, v'shavu me'eretz oyev, your children will return from the land of the enemy. It's just 2 verses. And if you think about these 2 verses, it's really an audacious prophecy that Yirmiyahu is making here. There's, to my mind, and maybe you can correct me, there's nothing like it that I know of anywhere else in Nevi'im. Where else do you find a Navi conjure up the image of another person from Tanakh who's dead and give you an insight into what that person is doing in heaven, that person is crying out their heart in heaven? It's utterly unprecedented. Where did Yirmiyahu get this from, this vision? And it seemed, maybe it was a nevuah and it was just, that's what it was, but it's an utterly unprecedented kind of thing. Whatever else this nevuah is, as a nevuah, I would like to suggest to you tonight that it is something else too. It is nothing less than, in 2 short sentences, an entire commentary on the Rachel and Leah story as we have it in Parshas Vayetze. If you read this, if you can decode these psukim, you will learn something. You will find a hidden commentary on Rachel's life. And what's amazing about this is that if I told you that I had uncovered, or that scholars had uncovered a hidden manuscript of the Rambam, right, where the Rambam wrote about who Rachel Imenu was, or a hidden manuscript of the Ramban, or of the Sforno, or of Sadyagon, and something that no one had ever seen before. You'd be very excited and would be very thrilled, and you'd really want to hear about this. But what if there was a hidden manuscript that wasn't the Ramban, and wasn't Rambam, and it wasn't the Sforno, but it was Yirmiyahu HaNavi himself giving you his commentary on what the Torah actually means to tell you in the story of Rachel? Like, you'd sit up and pay attention. That would be a big deal. I think that's what's actually here in these 2 psukim. There's a hidden commentary on the story. I want to go through it with you and try and learn it with you, but I think that if when we do learn it, it's almost as if you're sitting and chatting with Rachel Imenu in that coffee shop, and there's one other person in the room, Yirmiyahu HaNavi, who's there to make sure you understand everything that Rachel's telling you. And it's a remarkable kind of thing. So let me jump in and try to work it through with you. Let's begin with a question on the second pasuk here. And the psukim here, I'll just highlight them. They're up on the top of the screen. Pasuk Yud Daled and Tes Vav, right? These guys over here. So here's the thing. Here's Rachel. She's crying over her lost children. Now, if you were God, or if you had to characterize God's response, right, and you would have to attach some sort of emotion or some sort of characteristic to God's response. So how would you describe God's response to Rachel, right? Here Rachel's crying for her lost children, and God responds that there's nothing to worry about. You should dry your tears because your children will come home. Give me one word to describe that response. Comforting, right? Would you say that God's response displays compassion? You'd say it displays compassion. Interestingly, the Navi himself, Yirmiyahu Navi, does not say that God is responding with compassion to Rachel. He invokes an entirely different kind of response. If you read the words carefully, you don't even have to read them carefully, just read the words. Now read this. There is reward for what you've done, and your children will return from the land of the enemy. There's reward for what you've done? Reward for what has she done? Would you please explain to me the reward? In other words, you don't have to tell me like she's being rewarded, right? Like if I'm compassionate to you, I'm not rewarding you by being compassionate. It's just you're crying, right? So obviously, if I have a heart, I have to respond to your tears. What could be more poignant than a woman crying over a kidnapped children, right? You know, her children are gone, and she's crying, and God cares. So God says, dry your tears, everything's going to be okay. You don't have to explain that as there is reward for what you've done. There's no reward for what you've done. I feel moved, so I'm responding to you. What has she done that she's being rewarded for? Are you with me? Does this make sense? I mean, this is a normal question, yeah? So, what has she done? Now, if you wanted to, you could sort of use your thumbs and kind of fetch, right? You could say, well, really, it's her tears. She's crying. But it's a good thing that she's crying. So, Hashem's rewarding her for crying. You could say that, but it's not so convincing, right? If somebody's crying, you're not rewarding them for their crying. You're responding to their crying with compassion. So what, God doesn't have a heart? It wasn't enough that she was crying? Just she was crying, right? That's it. What do you mean? The Navi seems to suggest that as compassionate as God is being here, it's not really compassion that's happening. Rachel deserves this. She deserves it because of something that she has done. The great mystery that Yirmiyahu is holding out for us is what has she done? What has she done? So if you read the psukim again, you'll begin to get a hint. Let's go through it again, starting from the beginning. And as we do, I want to play one of my favorite games with you, which is where have we heard this before? Yirmiyahu Navi is echoing ideas in Tanakh that seem to come from somewhere other than just Yirmiyahu. For example, there's this voice in heavens that's crying out, bitter cries. Rachel mevakal baneha. Rachel is crying for her children. Well, let's start with these words over here. Me ana lihinachem. Okay, now stop. She refuses to be consoled. Where else in Tanakh do we have basically those words about someone else who has refused to be consoled? Yaakov. What are the words? The words actually are, they come after Mechiras Yosef, right? And the words are, Vayima'ein litnachem. Let me just throw it up on the screen for you, right? Here we have Me'ani linachem over here. And we can put this up on the screen here and just kind of move things around a little bit so we can see them side by side. And if you look here, right after Yaakov finds out what happens, Vayokumu kobanav v'chobanotav l'nachamo, vayima'ein lihitnachem. You see that? Me'ana linachem is just the feminine form. Lashon sivui, me'ana linachem is just the feminine form of vayima'ein lihitnachem. It's exactly the same thing. And why would we be going from here? Well, what happened over here? First of all, who was mourning? Yaakov was mourning. That was her husband who was mourning. What was he mourning? He was mourning the loss of Yosef. Who was Yosef's mother? Isn't that interesting? So here you have, in this image of Rachel crying over the Aseres HaShvatim, crying over Ephraim, centuries after Mechiras Yosef, Yirmiyahu is borrowing words and seems to be suggesting a link to the Yosef story. Why would that be? You know why? Because it wasn't just in the Galus Aseres HaShvatim when Rachel was missing children. There was another time that Rachel was missing children. When else did Rachel have a kidnapped child? Yosef. Yosef was the original kidnapped child of Rachel. So in this image of Rachel crying over her lost children, Yirmiyahu is going back and suggesting that this wasn't the first time she cried. She wouldn't have just cried now when all of her children were in Gullus. She was crying then when Yosef was taken. Now you'll come to me, you'll say, Rabbi Forman, that's ridiculous. She was dead. She was dead when Yosef was taken. How could she be crying? So Yirmiyahu would say, well, that's no kasha. She's dead now. Now that the Aseres HaShvatim are in Gullus, she's dead now. So you think death is enough to keep Rachel from storming the heavens for her kidnapped children? Something as trivial as death is not going to keep Rachel away from crying for her children. She'd be crying with the Aseres HaShvatim, and she'd be crying with Yosef. You think Yaakov was the only one who refused to be consoled? Vayima'en litznachem? No, me'ana linachem. She refused to be consoled also. Now, when you have something like this, a connection between these two stories, typically my experience is that it's either a coincidence or it's not a coincidence. This would have to be a pretty remarkable coincidence, but it could just be a coincidence. It could also be what I call a corner piece. The Torah, when usually it's almost like archaeology. If you're digging a skeleton out of the mud, right? So if you find a bone, a fossil, you're not sure if it's mud or if it's fossil, but one thing's for sure: if it's really a fossil, if it's really a rib, then what else is going to happen? As you keep on digging, you're going to find the rest of the rib cage. Here too, if this isn't a coincidence, if you keep on digging, you're going to find the rest of it. So let's keep on digging and see if there is a rest of it to be found. Let's look at this. Back to Yirmiyahu. Nehi b'chi tamrurim Rachel mevaka al baneha. Right before the image of Rachel refusing to be consoled, we get an image of a mother crying over her children. Let's go to Yosef. Was there a time when a parent cried over their children according to the text? Yes, it wasn't Rachel, it was Yaakov. Where does Yaakov cry? Right over here. Vayef goto aviv. Right? Father cries. Yirmiyahu says, Rachel mevaka al baneha. Rachel would have also cried. She cried for her children in Gullus. She would have also cried for Yosef, who essentially was in Gullus too, by the way, remember? Right? He was being taken down to Mitzrayim. Okay, let's see if there's anything else here that reminds us of anything. Let's go to this word over here. Let me highlight it for you. Strange word. Only time the word actually appears in Tanakh to my knowledge. Tamrurim. Nehi b'chi tamrurim. What's the shoresh of it? Mar, right? But it's mar with a double resh. So typically whenever you have doubled letters like that, it will indicate a real severity. Like, for example, Echa, right? With Esther, Echacha, right? So it's very, very severe. Vayit rotetzu abanim b'kirva, the double tzadi. So here too, tamrurim, right? That's going to be really, really, what's his name? Very, very bitter cry. Okay, now, for a free Coke, where in the Yosef story do you have a word that reminds you of tamrurim, a double resh with reference to the word bitter, mar? What's that? That's it. It's in Parshas Vayechi. Now, actually, let's go to Parshas Vayechi. I didn't have it up on the screen, but let me just call it up here for a moment. So here we have our handy-dandy Tanakh program, right? And let's just look for Vayimararuhu. Actually, I don't know if we spell it with a, it's probably with chaser, right? Yeah, no vav, right? There it is. All right, here it is. So you see that? Vayimararuhu. This is in Parshas Vayechi. They embittered his life. Whose bracha is this? Oh, it's Yosef's bracha, isn't that? Isn't that interesting? Right in Yosef's bracha, the bracha that Yaakov gives to Yosef, you've got that word, that double resh mar word, which seems to be tamrurim as a play off of it. Vayimararuhu, and they, the brothers, embittered his life. Now, how did the brothers embitter his life? Now, one of the grand questions is, we never really know if Yaakov ever found out about the sale of Yosef or not. But as you read through the story, you start getting these hints that he sort of kind of knew. And this is one of those hints. If he didn't know, he at least knew that the brothers really embittered his life. Vayimararuhu, they really embittered his life. Now, Rashi has something to tell us here. Rashi's bothered by the double resh, right? The double resh indicates a kind of doubling. Let's call up Rashi for a moment. Here we go. So here's Rashi. Let's find Pasuk Chaf Gimel here. And there it is. So Rashi, explaining the double Vayimararuhu, says there were two times that Yosef's life was embittered. One time was Vayimararuhu Echav. One time is when his brothers embittered his life, presumably when they threw him into a pit. The second time was Vayimararuhu Potifar V'ishto. Because remember, there was another time. If you think about the two lowest times in Yosef's life, wouldn't these be the two lowest times? A, his brothers throw him in a pit. But it's not the only time he gets thrown in a pit or thrown in a jail, right? It's actually not the only time he loses his coat, if you think about it. The other time he loses his coat and gets thrown into jail, it's almost like a replay, is in the Potiphar story, right? So like it happens twice. So Rashi says, yeah, that's why it's Vayimararuhu, doubled, right? He was double, it happened to him twice. He got victimized twice. He got thrown in a pit twice. He lost his coat twice. It was this awful experience, right? So the word tamrurim, you wonder, right, is this a reference to Yosef, his brothers throwing in a pit, and maybe another kind of terrible thing that happened? So let's actually go to the story of Eshes Potiphar for a moment. Let's take this off of our screen. And let me see, do we have it? Let's go back here. The story of Eshes Potiphar will take us into Perak Lamed Tes over here. Here we go. It's because it's funny that Rashi quotes these two times that his life is embittered, one time in the pit and the other time in Eshes Potiphar. Is there a reference to Eshes Potiphar in Yirmiyahu as well? Well, let's think for a moment. If you were Rachel, you'd for sure be crying at the moment that Yosef is thrown in the pit, right? That would be awful. And you'd probably also be crying at the moment that he's framed by Eshes Potiphar. Let's read through the story, sort of stop motion video for a moment. We're going to go through the story. I want you to tell me, if you were Rachel and you were watching the story, when would you cry? Okay? Let's play this game. All right, so here we go. We're reading through the story. She's getting seduced, right? And he's saying, no, I'm not going to do this. And Eno Gadol B'Bayit Hazeh, he's telling her how he can't do this. It's a terrible sin. And she doesn't take no for an answer. So one day she comes, Vatitfaseu B'Bigdo, she grabs hold of his cloak, says, Shichvaymi, she seduces him, Vayazov Bigdo V'Yadav, Vayanas Vayetze Chutza. And he leaves his cloak in her hands, right, and runs out. Now, what's interesting about this is that the first time his coat is stripped from him, he doesn't really have a choice. He's stripped of his coat by the brothers. Here he has a choice, right? He's actually making a proactive choice to leave his coat with her, which, by the way, from a strictly political consideration, may not have been the smartest thing in the world, right? But if Yosef is no dummy, he understands that it's not the smartest thing in the world, and he does it anyway. Because Yosef's greatness at that moment is that he has a choice of doing the right thing or not doing the right thing. And doing the right thing means being vulnerable to you framing me. So if that's the only way it is, then that's the only way it is. So this time, I leave my cloak with you, and I run outside. Okay, Vayihikir osa, ki azav bigdo biyadav v'yanasa chutza. When she saw that he slipped and ran outside, so what does she do? Vatikra la'anshe besa, vatomer lahem. She calls all of the other servants and says, Ru'u, hevi lanu ishiv tzachek banu. And she starts framing him, and she says, look, there's this Hebrew over here who came and he was trying to seduce me. He came to be with me, and I screamed out. Okay, now stop. Will you be crying yet? Yes, you'd be crying, maybe. But if the Torah just stopped here, I would say this isn't the worst part of it. Why? Because she still hasn't, because at this point it's a he says, she says, right? What takes it away from a he says, she says position? What happens next? Look at the next word. The next words are when you'd really cry if you're Rachel. Because the next thing that happens after she makes her claim is, she says, Vayhi kasham'o. And when he heard that I screamed, Vayhi kashamo ki yarimosi kol v'ekra, that I raised up my voice and I cried, when he heard that, Vayazov bigdo biyada, he left his coat with me. And here it is as proof. That's the O.J. Simpson glove, you know what I mean? That's it. Once you see the glove, don't talk to me, DNA evidence, all these things. I see the glove. You know, the glove fits or it doesn't fit. She's got the coat. Right? At that point, the jury is convinced. It doesn't even matter what he says anymore. If you're Rachel, when you see that, that's when you cry. That's when you know he's going down. Vayehi kasham'o, ki harimosi koli ve'ekra. Say those words. Vayehi kasham'o, ki harimosi koli ve'ekra. And when he heard that I raised up my voice and cried, when he heard, read it backwards now. Vayhi kasham'o ki harimosi koli. Koli, kol. Harimosi, birama. Kisham'o, nishma. It's kol birama nishma, backwards. It really was the case that Rachel cried twice. Tamrurim, two bitter cries. Once over the sale of Yosef, but another time over Eshes Potiphar. Speaking of backwards, why is it backwards? Why would Yirmiyahu take these words and rearrange them backwards? You know why? Because it's all backwards. These aren't just a bunch of parallels between the story of Yirmiyahu and the story of Yosef. These are parallels arranged in a very particular order. Watch the order. Start from the beginning. Ko amar Hashem, kol barama nishma. Thus says God, a voice is heard on high, a voice is heard in the heavens. That's a play off of Vayihi kasham'o ki arimosi koli ve'ekra, the story of Eshes Potiphar. Now think, if you were Rachel, we'll just do a little timeline over here. This is the times of Yirmiyahu, when her children are going into Galus, right? So she's very sad, she's crying. So now I think, when's the last time that Rachel cried over children who were lost, right? Who were stuck, who were kidnapped? It would have been, the last time would have been Eshes Potiphar, when Yosef was thrown in a pit, right? Now, if we go back a little bit more, earlier in the story, there would have been another time she cried, and keep on reading earlier in the story. Nihi b'chi tamrurim. Tamrurim suggests that there was a bitter cry. There were two times that she was crying. She wasn't just crying over Eshes Potiphar, she was crying over Yosef another time. Rachel mevakal baneha, a parent crying for children. A parent crying for children reminds us of an earlier time, here we go, earlier in the Yosef story, right, back in the end of chapter 37, when there was another parent who was crying, and that happened right over here, Vayef goto aviv. Now, if you proceed further in Yirmiyahu, you'll proceed further back in the Yosef story. The next thing you have is this word, these words, me'ana li nachem. She refuses to be consoled. Now go back in the Yosef story previous to Vayefko to Aviv, and you will find these words right here. Vayima'en lihitnachem. He refused to be consoled. And now the question is, does the pattern continue still further? Will it be the case that as we continue to read the Rachel story, the Yirmiyahu story, will we continue to go farther and farther back into Rachel's life or into Yosef's life? Well, let's see. Me'ana linachem, she refuses to be consoled, Yirmiyahu says, al baneh, over his children, ki einenu, because they are gone. Einenu. Does einenu remind you of anything in the Yosef story? Yes, that's later in the story. Turns out that the word einenu appears 3 times in Sefer Bereshis to refer to children that are gone. The only times it refers to children that are gone is in Bereshis and Chumash, 3 times. Every last time it refers to Yosef. The first of those times, the first instance of einenu. What's that? Yes, right, so that's another one. Children who are lost, that's right. So you have it with Hanoch, right, who was taken. And then in the Yosef story, you have it right over here. Reuven. Vayashav elechav. Reuven, first person to discover Yosef's disappearance, comes back to his, according to the Rashbam I'm going with now, but let's not get complicated, right? Reuven, first person to realize Yosef's disappearance. Vayomer hayeled einenu. He's gone, right? So this is actually the moment of the sale, not later when Yaakov's refusing to be consoled, but the moment of the sale. Al baneh ki einenu. Now the question is, we're halfway through Rachel. If you keep on going forward in the Yirmiyahu story, will you keep on going backwards in Rachel's life? And now let me ask you this. Would there have been another time that Rachel would have cried over children because there were none? Before the Aseret HaShvatim, before the loss of Yosef. When she didn't have children. She was not Kara all of those years. She comes to Yaakov and says, Hava li banim, ve'im ayin, mesa anochi. Right? Give me children. Right? You have to. To which Yaakov responds rather callously, according to Chazaq. Says, Hatachat Elokim ani? Hey, you're talking to the wrong person. Right? You got the wrong guy. You think I'm God? Asher mana mimech pribaten, that held you back from having children? Go talk to God. Keep on reading. Ko amar Hashem. What's the next words? Min'i kolech. Min'i anyone? What did Yaakov tell her? Hatachat Elokim ani. Am I in place of God? Asher mana mimech pribaten. Let me just throw it up on the screen so you see what I'm talking about. Here it is. Right? Am I in place of God who heard, right? So we'll come back to this. Let me just continue. But if you go further back in her life, what you're actually getting to is this story now. We get to this mysterious contention of Yirmiyahu, that there is schar coming to Rachel. There's reward, but we don't know what for. Yirmiyahu tells you what the reward is for. It's actually in the words, Yesh Sachar Lipulatech themselves. And this was the part of the speech that my wife kicked me for. She says, listen to what he's saying. You're going to find this very interesting. The little insight, right, which was the beginning of a real jigsaw puzzle, was what he was saying was, isn't it interesting that Yesh Sachar is Yud, Sin, Chaf, Resh. Yisachar. It's the birth of Yisachar. When Yisachar born? Yisachar was born in the moment that Rachel was most pained about not having children. Leah had 4 children. She was desperate. And finally she had this chance. It was her night to be with Yaakov, and she gave it up. And Leah had a child instead of her. You get the sense that it could have been her child, but it wasn't. And Leah's child was named Yisachar. Yesh Sachar Lipulatech. There's reward for what you've done. There was something about the birth of Yisachar, which is an eternal reward for Rachel, Yirmiyahu seems to suggest. But in order to understand that, you have to go back to Vayetze and understand why. Yirmiyahu is giving you a clue, a key, as to how to understand Parshas Vayetze. The way Yirmiyahu is reading of Parshas Vayetze is a way that Rachel's actions in the birth of Yisachar are an enduring source of scar for her, and it's the reason why her children are going to come home. Now, all we need to do is piece together the story and understand why, and that brings us to the mysterious story of the Dudaim. So let's go back and read through that story and try to piece together how Yirmiyahu might have understood it. I'm sorry, this is, let's get the right screen up here for you. Okay, let's start from here. To set the scene, Rachel has had a hard life. She has waited for 7 years to marry the man of her dreams, only to be tricked under the chuppah and to have her sister substituted against her will. As if that wasn't enough, she has to watch while Leah gives birth to child after child after child, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. And that finally brings us to this moment. Vatera Rachel. Rachel saw ki lo yalda liYaakov, that she had not given birth to Yaakov. Vatkanei Rachel ba'achota, and Rachel became jealous of her sister. Vatomer al Yaakov, and she says to Yaakov, Hava li banim, give me children. Vim ayin, ayin, by the way, an interesting word. Ayin is going to become einenu, right? Ayin is the beginning, right? When I didn't have any children, it was ayin. But later on, when my children's taken from me, it's einenu. Anyway, vim ayin, if I don't have children, mesa anochi, I'm dead. Now, what she really means is I'm as good as dead, right? But what she's actually saying is, like, if I don't have children, it's like you might as well kill me. I'm dead. What was Yaakov's response? Vayichar af Yaakov Rachel. Yaakov became angry with Rachel. Vayomer atachat Elokim anochi. And the sages Chazal are critical of him here. They say, Kach onim es hameikos. This is the way you treat a woman in pain. You say atachas Elokim anochi. You say you can't daven for her. They don't like what he says here. But this is what he says. Hatachas Elokim anochi. You think I'm in place of God? Asher mana mimech pri batan, that held you back from having children? You got the wrong address. Go talk to God. Enter Yirmiyahu. This word over here, I'm sorry, I lost my cursor over here, but there, Asher mana mimech pri baten. In Yirmiyahu, where does the word mana show up again? Remember? It's the very first word that God says comforting to Rachel. Right? Min'i kolech mibechi. Hold back your voice from crying. Now, let's just put two and two together. Let's just do the math over here. What did Yaakov say? What did Rachel say? What did Yaakov say? Rachel said, give me children, otherwise I'm dead. Go to Yirmiyahu. Who do we meet? A dead Rachel. Rachel's actually dead now, right? So, give me children, otherwise I'm dead. Yaakov. Who do you think I am? God? Go talk to him. Yirmiyahu. What's happening? There's a dead Rachel, and what's she doing? Talking to God. Right? Rachel's saying, look, the last time I came to you, and you said, talk to him. And I said, I'm dead. And you said, you got the wrong address, talk to God. So now Rachel's dead. She says, I have a problem with my children. I know who to talk to. God. It's the person, it's the one you told me to talk to last time. Right? Now, when Yaakov said, Atachat Elokim ani asher mana mimech pri baten, he sort of cast God in a rather harsh light, right? Who is God? You know who God is? God's the one. He's the one. You want to be mad at someone? Don't get mad at me. Be mad at God. God's the one who held you back from having children. That's not a nice thing to say about God. Along comes God, and what does God say? Okay, so now you're dead and you're coming to me? Let me tell you something. That same word that your husband said, that I was the one who held you back from having children, let me start with that word. And it's not a harsh way I'm going to start. It's a compassionate way. I take the harshness of Asher Mana Mimech Pribatem, and it becomes Min'i Kolech Midachi. Hold back your voice from tears. It's going to be okay. Yes, I was the one who held you back from children. There's no question about that. But there was a reason for it. The reason for it, as you will see soon, is so that you could hold back your voice from crying now. You had a reward coming for you, but I couldn't give it to you then. I had to give it to you now. But you'll see, we're not there yet. The word min'i in Yirmiyahu seems like a play off another word earlier in Yirmiyahu. Let's go back to it and see if you can find it. If we go back to Yirmiyahu, which is here, right? Look at that word min'i. What word earlier does min'i seem to be a play off of earlier in the Yirmiyahu passage? Sounds like what other word? Me'ana, right? Me'ana linachem. She refuses to be consoled, to which God says, no, you should be consoled. Min'i kolech mibechi, hold back your tears. Now, we pointed out earlier that when she is me'ana linachem, that's just the feminine version of what happened to Yaakov. Yaakov held himself back from being consoled also in the death of Yosef. And Rashi there wonders why. Rashi asks a question. He says, why was it that Yaakov refused to be consoled? Everybody gets consoled, right? Everyone gets consoled. Loss is something we learn to get over eventually. It gets better with time. Zok Yaakov says it's not getting better with time. Ki ered el b'ni avel shola. I am going down to my grave mourning this child. It will never, ever get better. Vayakumu kol banav v'chol bnatav l'nachmo. And all of his children got up to try to comfort him. Vayima'en litnacham. And he would not be consoled. He was going to go down to his grave mourning. Rashi wonders why. How is he going to go down to his grave mourning? No one goes down to their grave mourning like that. Rashi says the reason why is because Yosef wasn't really dead. And you can only stop mourning when someone's really dead. But when you don't see a body, when they're not really dead, it's never really over. And because it's never really over, you can't really get over it. There's something about avelos, the process of getting over a loss, starts with kavura. Kavura is when you say goodbye. If you can really say goodbye and it's over, you can move on, slowly, but you can move on. But if you can never say goodbye, especially because he's really alive, right? So if he's really alive, you can't get over a loss when they're really alive. It's just this festering wound. It's an open wound. And even though Yaakov didn't know consciously he was really alive, but the fact that he was really alive meant that he couldn't get over it. Now, if that's why Yaakov couldn't get over it, why can't Rachel get over it? Here comes Rachel. All of the tribes are lost. She refuses to be consoled. Along comes God and says, you're me'ana linachem. I say to you, min'i kolech mibechi. Stop crying. You know why? Because you know why you know your children are coming back? Because you can't stop crying. What does it tell you that you can't stop crying? It tells you they're not really gone. It tells you that they're coming back. That it's not a closed book. It isn't over for good. So the very fact that you feel like you have to keep on crying is itself proof that your children are coming home. It happened once before. That's how Yosef came home. Remember Yosef? Yosef came home. So your children are going to come home too. It's going to be okay. So let's go back to the story. Back to the story of Rachel. I'm sorry.
Why the next sentence is an unique nephew? Why does God then say that she should move back in the next sentence?
Hold on for 1 second, and I will try my best to answer your question once I get the right thing up on the screen. Where am I looking for? Here we go. Okay, what was your question?
If they're, but God does say you should hold back your crime, so if it's still there, she should keep running. If the tribes are still there, still exist in this, she should keep running. Why does he ask her to stop running to be the consolation?
Well, what the idea is that you can be consoled, right? In other words, you can accept consolation. The idea before that is she refuses to be consoled. So the idea is that it's an irony. It's sort of one of these. It's an infinite loop, right? But you should be consoled because your children are coming. Your children will come home, right? So you'll cry, but you can be consoled. And yet she can't be consoled because her children are coming home. So it's an open wound. But that's the reason she should be consoled. So it's kind of an open loop. But just give me a second. It's kind of complicated, so I don't want to take questions yet. I'll take questions at the end, but let me finish building this for you so you don't lose the thought process. Okay, what happens next? So here's Rachel. She doesn't have any children. Leah has 4 children, Vatomar. And what happens? She says, okay, fine. I'm not getting any help from you, Yaakov. Hinei amasi bila boi le'avatelet al birkai v'yibana gam anochi mimena. Right? Let Bilhah have a child, and maybe I can raise that child, and it'll be my child. So he gives Bilhah to her. She gives Bilhah to Yaakov, and Bilhah gets pregnant and has a child, and she names the child Dan. And here's what she says: Danani Elokim, v'gam shama b'koli v'yitem li ben al ken kara shmo Dan. God has judged me and has listened to my voice and given me a child. Now, if you're Rachel in this instance, and you had to interpret why it is you have this child, you have the sense that God gave you this child, right? How would most of us have explained God's treatment of her in giving this child? You would have said, here, I didn't have children all this time, and finally I have a child. I'm so happy, right? And God is so kind. So that's what you would have said. You would have attributed it to God's compassion. Here, I didn't have any children. God's very nice to me. He's very compassionate. He gave me a children. Wrong. That's not how Rachel understands it. Danani Elokim does not mean God was compassionate to me. It means God judged me. It means I deserve this child. Right? I deserve this child. And God has listened to my voice. I finally got what I deserve. Now the question is Rachel right or is Rachel wrong? That's certainly Rachel's perspective. Is she right or is she wrong? Did God judge her and find her deserving? Well, from Rachel's perspective, you would say, look, I had a very hard life. I got switched under the chuppah after waiting for 7 years. That wasn't very fair. And then my sister has child after child, and I can't have children, and that's not very fair. So I deserve something over here. So God has given me what I deserve. That's one way to see it. But is that correct?
I don't feel that way at all.
You don't read Danani Elokim.
I read it as her feeling second best, and even getting this child is just the second best. It's like, once again, I must have done something wrong to deserve not having a child, and now it's like a second best. It's Bilhah's child. I don't read
Yeah,
it
but what she's saying is Danani Elokim Gam Shama B'Koli. God has listened to
still a
me.
piece of it, like it's not.
Well, she's definitely not she's not a happy camper, right? But she's got something. It's like it's 4-1, you know? And she's got something here. And she feels, finally, I have some vindication. Now, whether she's right or whether she's wrong, we don't know. But we do know one thing. What she's saying is dangerous. And the reason why it's dangerous is because if you see yourself locked in struggle with your sister in a zero-sum game, and there are these children, and I have nothing, and I have nothing, and she came along, and she took my husband, and then finally, I have a child. And instead of seeing it as God was nice to me, was very compassionate, I say, God has vindicated my position. Why is that dangerous? It's dangerous because it locks out the possibility of compromise with your sister. Do you understand what happens? If you're locked in a struggle with your sister, so as long as we leave God out of it, do you understand? As long as you leave God out of it, then there's a possibility for us getting along and we can be one happy family and all of that. But the problem is, if I'm locked in struggle with you and you're my sister, And I think that, it wasn't really so fair what you did for me, and it's not really so nice that you have all these children. And then I think, no, my position is now vindicated by God. So now it's like, once God comes into the picture, so then what? So now I'm right? Well, if I'm right and there's a zero-sum game here, then does that mean you're wrong? Like, what does that really mean? That's sort of a dangerous thing. And if this is sort of edging close to a cliff, Rachel gets even closer to the cliff with her next child. Look at this. She has another child from Bilhah, and here's the name she gives. Naftule Elokim niftalti im achoti gam yacholti. Divine struggles, I have struggled with my sister, and I have held my own. Right? What is she saying? She's saying, I'm locked in combat with my sister, but it's not just me and my sister. It's Naftule Elokim niftalti. It's struggles of God with my sister. It's a divine struggle. I put God in the mix. Once you put God in the mix, right? Gam Yaholti, and I've held my own. It reminds me, by the way, of Yaakov of the angel, right? It's the same sort of language of the struggling with God and people and prevailing. But leave that out for a moment. But what's scary about this is that, if it's just a struggle, it's a struggle and we can compromise. But if it's a divine struggle, what's the only thing that keeps compromise out of things? Why is holy war the scariest thing in the world? Right? Because once God is involved, you can't compromise. Because if I compromise and God vindicated my position, what am I saying to God? I'm throwing it back in your face when you vindicated my position. I can't compromise. God himself came and said, this is the way it is. So this is a very dangerous position to be in if the person you're struggling with is your sister. What happens next? Vatera Leah. Ki amda miletas. Leah then sees that she doesn't have any children, so she takes Zilpah and gives her to Yaakov, and Zilpah has 2 children. The second of those 2 children, she names Asher, and look at why. Vatomer Leah, Be'ashri, I am so fortunate. Everything is going so well. Ki ishruni abanot. The women around town, they will all sing my praises because I have so many kids, I don't even know what to do with them anymore. Vatikra Shemo Asher, and therefore I call him fortunate. Now, if you're Rachel and you're watching this, what are you thinking now? Here you thought it was 4-2, and God was on my side, and he was vindicating my position. But if that's the idea, that you're vindicating your position by having children, then when Leah, doesn't even go rest my kids, she's so happy that she has so many kids she can't count, and she's so fortunate, it's like the most shattering thing in the world. What happens next? Vayelech Ruvain b'mei Ksir Chitim. The next story we have is the story of the Dudaim. ArtScroll says the story of the Dudaim is the most mysterious story in Chumash. May well be. Why would you consider the story mysterious? Vayelech Ruvain b'mei Ksir Chitim. Ruvain goes in the harvest of the wheat. Vayimtza Dudaim basada, and he finds Dudaim, these flowers in the field, and he brings them to Leah. And there becomes this contention over the flowers. The reason why it's mysterious is because all the Mefarshim struggle, basically, with what are these Dudaim and what exactly is their meaning. So some people say, well, they're aphrodisiacs and it was very important, and some people say they were fertility symbols, so they were important. Okay, but let's just keep it simple for a moment. In Pashut Pshat, do you know what Dudaim are? Yeah, how do you know they're mandrakes? You know they're mandrakes because the JPS translates as mandrakes, that's why. And maybe ArtScroll translates as mandrakes. The only way you'd actually know what they are is you have to look elsewhere in Chumash to find the word, and if you do, you will not find it. The word never appears except in Shir HaShirim. Now, the problem is, if I'm living after the Torah is written before Shir HaShirim is written, I still don't know what Dudaim are. So in other words, Dudaim and Shir HaShirim take off of Dudaim here. But how did Shlomo HaMelech know what Dudaim are? So this is an interesting question, and we'll come back to Shir HaShirim. But let's just pretend we're living in the times of Yoshua ben Nun. Shir HaShirim has not been written yet. What are Dudaim? Now, the Torah doesn't tell you what they are, and the Torah doesn't bother telling you what they are. In Pashut Pshat, that means what? If the Torah doesn't tell you what the Dudaim are, what does that tell you? It tells you it does not matter what they are. It's completely irrelevant what they are. So it's a total red herring to start thinking, oh, it's fertility, it's this, it's that. It just doesn't matter, which actually is the position taken by Rashi. Rashi's position is that the Dudaim were weeds. Okay, they were like dandelions. They were completely worthless. They were pretty, they were like some sort of wildflower. Rashi goes on to say that Reuven was such a good guy that he didn't go like taking wheat, which the owner of the field might be makbid on. He took something that was absolutely worthless, that nobody would be makbid on. It was like dandelions, right? He comes home, he's a 6-year-old kid, and he's coming home with dandelions for his mother. That's what the story is about. So now, if it's about dandelions, then what's the big deal? The answer is, it's not about the Dudaim. It's about who's bringing the Dudaim and what they represent. So now let's read the story. Reuven comes, and he finds these dandelions in the field. Vayaveotam el Leah imo, and he brings them to Leah, his mother. And now listen to Rachel. Vatomer Rachel el Leah. Rachel says to Leah, Tni na li miduda ebnech. 2 words that you need to pay attention to here that we don't often pay attention to. First, the word please. Please give me. Now, the second thing is, does she want all the Dudaim or just some of them? Mi duda ebnech. She only wants some of them. Please give me some of the Dudaim of your son. Now stand back and ask this. What was she really asking for? And why is she asking for this now? What's the meaning of these Dudaim? If you're in Rachel's shoes, why do you want some dandelions in a little cup over your windowsill too? That's right. In other words, think about what this is. Why do these Dudaim matter? Little 6-year-old Reuven. It's Reuven. Who is Reuven? Leah's son, but not just Leah's son. Leah's Bechor. Her firstborn is 6 years old and comes home with dandelions. Why are those dandelions precious? Every parent knows why they're precious. If you're a parent, you know that parenting for a good long while is a one-way street, basically, right? You form the child in a womb, you give the child everything, and you give, and you give, and you give. And there comes a moment at some point in the kid's life when the kid starts to give back. And that's the most precious moment in the world. There will come a time when that kid will be your equal. But it starts young. When they're 6 years old, the first time that the kid makes a little birthday card, and it's all scratchy, and it's all nothing. But with a smile, they come and present that. Mommy, I made you a birthday card. I love you. Here, right? That is the most precious birthday card in the world. Because it's the first time that child has given something back to you. And giving something back is the biggest deal in the world. You're giving us prizes. A little too emotional for the child. It's a Bechorah giving back. Do you know, we have something called Bikurim. What are Bikurim? Why would God want first fruits from us? You know, anybody would know that you don't buy blueberries at the beginning of the season, you know what I mean? Like the blueberries at the beginning of the season, the first fruits, those are the worst blueberries. So why does God want the blueberries from the beginning of the season? The answer is, God doesn't care about the quality of the fruits, it's the fact that it's first. In other words, the idea is that God is our parent in heaven, and He's giving us everything. And finally, we're in Eretz Yisrael, and we finally have our first fruits, and we can give something back. Those are the most precious things in the world, when you can come with something and say, God, I'm giving you a little something back. That's Bikurim. This is the beginning of Bikurim. It's the first fruits of a Bechor. These dandelions are precious. Rachel watches those dandelions, and she looks at them and says, her whole paradigm has been shattered. And she says, you know, maybe I'll never have a child. But she's making a plea. Please give me some of the dandelions of your child that I can put them above my window too. What is she really saying? She's saying maybe we can put down the sword. Maybe we can stop viewing this as a zero-sum game of me against you. Maybe I can share in a little bit of your joy, if I can share in the joy of those dandelions, in that joy of a mother, if we can be mothers together, right, then we don't have to be locked in combat. It was her kind of peace offering to Leah, right? Maybe we can put this behind us. Could you give me some of the dandelions? Listen to Leah's response. Leah's response is shocking, right, given this. Vatomer la, Leah responds, Hama'at kachtech et ishi, v'lakachat gam et dudae b'nei? Was it not enough that you took my husband? That you also took, that now you want my dandelions? If you were Rachel, what would you want to do now? You don't even want to say what you would want to do now. If you were Rachel, listen to these words from Leah. Was it not enough that you took my husband? That you also want my dandelions? If you're Rachel, you would say, 1 second. What do you mean that I took your husband? Let's start with that, okay? I didn't take your husband. You were the one that took my husband. Do you remember that, right? That night when you took him, it was supposed to be me. What do you mean I took your husband? This is Rachel's greatness. What happens next? If you and I were Rachel, that would have been our response. But that wasn't Rachel's response. Listen to Rachel's response. Rachel's response is, Vatamer Rachel. Rachel says, really? Lachain, therefore, if that's really so, that's actually how you see it? I never knew. I could have never imagined. Lachain yishkavi machalayla. This whole time, while I was craving children, I was blind to the fact that you were craving something. This whole time, you thought I took him from you. How could that even be? And then she realizes there's another side of the story, a side that you never see if you were Rachel. The Sforno lays it out. The Sforno says, here's what Leah was thinking. From Leah's perspective, there is another side to the story. First of all, we do not have evidence that Leah knew of the bargain made between Rachel and Yaakov. You just don't know that she knew. For all you know, she doesn't know. But even if she knew that Rachel was supposed to marry Yaakov, that they had had that deal, how much choice did she really have? Here it is. One day, Lavan decides, Vayesov Lavan and Kol Anshe HaMakom. Lavan gathers everyone together, Vayas Mishten, makes this party, and then at the party, points to Leah and says, go in the dressing room, here's a white dress, put it on, you're up. Right? It all happens so fast. You can't defy your father in that situation. She doesn't have a choice. So she marries Yaakov despite herself. It wasn't her doing. But the Sforno says, after I married him, you had a choice whether you would marry him a week later or 7 years later, whatever. You didn't have to accept that barter. You were taking my husband. I was already married to him. That's her way of seeing it. The fact is, both of these women have been victimized, but not by each other. They've been victimized by their father. One of the great issues in life is when you become invested in a position, one of the reasons why compromise is so impossible is because of the illusion that my position is the way of thinking of it. Do you know what I mean? And those were the steps that Rachel was taking closer and closer to the cliff. Naftuli Elokim niftalti. Divine struggles, and God has vindicated my position. Well, if you really believe God has vindicated your position, that your position is right, that you have the way of looking at it, then when Leah comes and says, you took my husband, there's no way I can compromise with you, I'm out of there. The godless of Rachel, her greatness is, she steps back from the cliff and says, you know what? There is another way of looking at this. It's not God vindicating my position. There is another way of looking at this. It's like, the Monopoly board. There's Little Hat, there's Little Shoe, and there's Parker Brothers, Parker Brothers is the head of the board. So if Little Hat thinks they're Parker, you're in big trouble. Little Hat's never going to be able to get along with Little Shoe. Little Hat has to understand that they're just a piece on the board, just like Little Shoe. And then you can compromise. And that's what Rachel does. Lachain yishkavi machalayla. This whole time, when I was desperate for children, I may have been desperate for children, but you were desperate for the companionship of a man that you thought you never had, and you thought that I took him from you. And therefore, it's not really fair for me to ask you to share in the joy of children without me responding to your need for companionship. Let me give you a gift. Lachen yishkavi ma halayla. Let him be with you tonight. And if you think about the meaning of what happens in that moment, something magical and redemptive happens from both the perspective of Rachel and the perspective of Leah. From Rachel's perspective, here she was, victimized by her father, switched under the chuppah. A night that she was supposed to be with her beloved husband, and instead Leah is there and she has nothing to do with it. Look how powerful and redemptive her action is now. What is she doing now? She's reenacting that night. That night when he was supposed to be with her, but was with Leah instead. But instead of being a victim, instead of having no choice, she's making a choice. She's saying, it wouldn't be right for me to insist on this. Let me give this to you. And now she goes through the trauma again, but she goes through it proactively, just like Yosef did later on in the story of Eshes Potiphar. Yosef came from the same Rachel who was able to take the trauma of losing his coat and then reenacting it. It's right for me to lose my coat. Let me leave you my coat and go back into the pit. He learned that from somewhere. He learned that from his mother, what his mother did. And now think of it from Leah's perspective. Leah engineers this barter, runs out to her husband. Look at the words, Vatetse Leah Hasadeh. Leah goes out into the fields. And she says, Likraso, to meet Yaakov coming back from the field, and says, you'll be with me tonight because I bought you for these dudaim. What does that remind you of? Think about from Leah's perspective, what was the trauma of that poisonous night when she was switched, when she had no choice? There had been a barter. There had been a deal between Yaakov and Lavan. And now, she was being substituted. It was a mekaftos. It was a false transaction. He didn't even know it was her until the morning. How is she going to redeem that? And since then, he's so resentful, and the resentment seethes, and she's never loved. Until now, when she enacts her part of it. Let's go through this again. There'll be another barter. And Rachel's going to buy into it this time. And I'm not going to deceive you, Yaakov. You'll know exactly who you're with. I bought you. We're redoing it. The barter. But this time, I'm in charge, and she's going along with it, and she agrees, and I'm not deceiving her, and I'm not deceiving you. Everything is above board. And now, after tonight, we're going to go through that wedding night one more time. And there's never any pain anymore. You can leave it all behind, because it's all above board, and everyone knows what's happening. So all of the hatred and all of the resentment can be gone now. We can start over. And from here on, you never hear of Leah anymore as a snua, as someone who's hated anymore. She's able to redeem that. And Rachel is able to redeem that. And they both have children. The first child is Leah's. Leah has a child. And she says, Natan Elokim schari. God has given my reward. Asher natati shivchati le'yeshiva tikra shmo Yisachar. Again, the question you have to ask is she right or is she wrong? At this point, from Leah's perspective, her idea is that I deserve this child. God has given me this child as reward because I gave my maidservant to my husband. Well, that's questionable that you deserve reward for giving your maidservant to your husband. That was because you wanted children when you couldn't have children. Are you really being rewarded? Leah's name is correct. The only thing she's wrong about is who we're talking about. There is reward for giving the person you're supposed to be with to another woman. But it's not Leah's reward right now. It's whose reward? It's Rachel's reward. That's what Rachel did. to give birth to Yisachar, to Leah. Rachel could have had a child that night. Instead, she gave a woman, Leah, to her husband. Leah's right, but it's not her. She calls him Yisachar because she says there was schar. And now Yirmiyahu comes, and Yirmiyahu says, going all the way back through the Yosef story, to the moment before Yosef, to the moment when Rachel didn't have children, Yesh Sachar L'Puratech. There is schar for you, Rachel. What schar? Schar in the word of Yisachar. You didn't have a child last night. You gave her a great gift. And your greatest moment of pain, when you so desperately wanted to have a child, you let her have another one. That child's name is Yisachar, but you know what? Yesh Sachar, there is reward for you. You had to live with the pain of seeing Leah have another child, yet another child, a child that could have been yours, that you think should have been yours, but instead is in the camp of a rival. Do you know what the reward for that is? Right now you have one child, Yisachar, that you think should be yours, who's in the camp of a rival sister. There will come a time in history when there will be hundreds of thousands of your children in the camps of enemies, not rivals, in the camps of the king of Ashur who takes them kidnapped. And that is the time when I will give you the reward. The Shavu Banim Me'eretz Oyev, your children will come back from the land of the enemy. I was the one who held you back from having children. You said, Danani Elokim v'gam shama b'koli. You were right, I judged you. You were just wrong when. I didn't judge you back then. That was compassion. There would be a moment when I would judge you. The moment is centuries later, when you come crying to me for children. And I say, Yesh Sachar L'Pulatech, the reward that was built up from you, I didn't give you with one child. I gave you with many, many children coming back from the enemy. Rachel will have a child. After this, after she redeems that painful night, her next child, the next thing that happens is the birth of Yosef. And a very special child that is, because Yosef has the ability to do what she did, to be able to redeem that moment of victimhood with a proactive moment. And when Yosef redeems that moment of victimhood in Ashes Potiphar, Rachel cries again. Why does she cry? She cries because, on the one hand, my child is being victimized. But on the other hand, this is his finest hour. He learned from me. He stood up for what is right. He gave a gift. And there will be reward for that. And he will come back. He comes back. And all of Rachel's children come back. This, I think, is the hour in the coffee shop with Rachel. I hope you enjoyed it. And I invite you to